In this video, we're going to take a look at the summer 2016 question paper 41. We're going to start with jumping down to the questions to preview them before we go back and consider the case. There's 4 questions, A through D. A and B are both 5-mark questions, C is 4, and D is 6. I'm now going to go over each question individually and try to figure out what information I'm going to need as I start reading the case. So for A, I need to identify the trends in working population in China and consider whether they are what might be expected in an emerging economy. So that means I will probably have to take a look at some kind of labor force statistics and then use that information to assess the changes using specific data, and then from there, analyzing a trend. B asks us to analyze whether falling prices necessarily harm an economy, which means when I go to the case, I've got to first see where prices are falling, understand why that might be bad, and then consider, well, how that might be actually beneficial to some. C asks us if the article gives us enough evidence to conclude that the changes in the Chinese economy would be bad for their trade partners. So we need to look for evidence that supports that and then potentially look at evidence that exists to counter it, or we need to consider where we could find out more information, or if the case doesn't actually give enough evidence. Finally, we need to look at discussing what difference an investment approach to growth and a consumption approach to growth might make to an emerging economy such as China. Now that requires us to somewhat look at the case study, but also use some of our own knowledge. So we're going to have to distinguish between the two approaches and what potential results they may have on the economy. With that done, I'm going to go back to the case study. We'll read it together, annotate it together, and see what information we can gather that will help us answer these 4 questions. And next we're going to work on a reading of the case study to kind of gather the information we need to answer questions. As I read it, I'm going to make notes. So you'll see that the notes should populate on the right side of the screen as I read. So to quickly recap, the questions I need to answer are about the labor force and how it's changing, falling prices and influences on the countries that trade with China, and then looking at investment versus consumption approach. So let's get started. Firstly, it states that China is an emerging economy. So if we've studied this before, we should know that emerging economies have certain characteristics that contrast with developed economies. And we should be clear on what those are in a second. Let me change this so we can see a little bit better. Okay. So the proportions of workers employed by sector between 1990 and 2012 are shown in figure 1. So what you'll notice in all of your CIE paper 4s is that there's always going to be some kind of graphic that you need to interpret or extract information from. So you should have come across quite a few of these in your time studying. But if you haven't, go back to the past papers and see the kind of information that they present. So from here, we can see from 1990 to 2012 that the population, or the working population, in the primary sector has decreased from 60.1% to 33.6% in 2012. And then you can see in the secondary sector, I'm just making short notes here. Let's actually change that. Secondary sector from 21.4% to 30.3%, and tertiary sector services from 18.5% to 36.1%. So you should be familiar with each of these primary, secondary, and tertiary sector, what they mean, even before you start reading this. Okay, let's go down to the next one. So iron ore is used for steel making. By 2013, China was the largest iron ore importer in the world. The main suppliers were Australia, Brazil, India, and South Africa. China also needed raw materials such as aluminum and copper. As a proportion of GDP, China brought 4 to 10 times more of these than other countries, and was responsible for much of the global increase in their demand during the 2 decades before 2013. So here we have evidence that China is a major importer of iron ore, aluminum, and copper. So yes, they import it, but we have to remember that everybody imports it at different rates. So the extent to which China imports it is relevant to that next question. The iron and steel industry in China was stimulated by strong domestic demand. So we need to know what that means. Right, domestic demand is demand that exists domestically, and I'll explain what that means, particularly from the construction, manufacturing, and automotive industries. So that means the firms in construction, firms that are in production and manufacturing, as well as firms that make cars, they've increased their production, so they need more iron and steel. But during 2013, the outlook for China's economy was less bright. There was a sharper than expected fall in export growth in China, while imports actually fell. So here we can see that China is exporting less and importing less as well. Growth in industrial output was also slower, and this, together with increased output from new iron ore mines in Australia, seemed likely to cause a reduction in iron ore prices. So now we can see that falling demand in China depressed iron ore prices, as did increased supply by Australian firms. So it's thought that the potential change in industrial output in China, the world's second largest economy, would worsen the outlook not only for mining companies but also for other producers worldwide. So this looks like we could add this to that third question, right? The influence of China's falling demand on trade partners. There's some evidence here to use in our discussion later. Statistics for the annual rate of inflation in China indicated that in 2013, prices of key products such as iron ore fell, causing the rate of inflation to fall and creating the prospect of price deflation. So here we have evidence to discuss falling prices. An economist said that falling prices are bad for the economy. Some economists feared that the future growth of building and urbanization would be at a significantly slower rate. The result, it was thought, would be that any economic growth would be more likely to be caused by consumption and not investment. So an economist said, and here we have to look at what's the logic behind this, right? And also what could be a counter argument. All right, so we finished this paragraph by saying the result, it was thought, would be that any economic growth would be more likely caused by consumption and not investment. So we need to distinguish between those two. This change to consumption from investment would mean that the demand for raw material inputs would fall significantly, as previous demand was a consequence of China's growth through an investment approach. So what that means is that the initial demand for raw materials was driven by investment growth. So firms putting money into the production process, increasing and expanding output. Of course, items such as cars, washing machines, and computers all require a substantial amount of raw material, so the demand for some inputs would still increase. So this is consumption growth, consumption-led growth. Okay, right now we have enough information to answer the questions that we needed to. What I'm going to do next is go through each question in turn, show you an answer, connect it to the evidence that is applicable for each question, if it is applicable at all, and then go through and discuss what you should be writing to answer those questions. What I've done here, obviously you would not be doing on the exam day, but the main reason I've done this is so you can see the thought process you should have as you read. You can underline and draw attention to certain things that you think might help you when you're answering your questions. And while this might seem like common sense to quite a few of you, I've noticed that when I collect in students' work, sometimes they actually don't do that. And I highly encourage you, if it helps you, to approach your reading like this. All right, now let's take a look at some questions. What I'll do now is take a look at question A. Identify the trends in working population in China and consider whether they are what might be expected in an emerging economy. This is a 5-mark question, and my answer is already written here. All I'm going to do is compare it to the mark scheme, which is just below here. So what the mark scheme is asking us to do is mention that the primary sector employment is down, secondary and tertiary has increased, and candidates should give figures to support this, which means there should be information from the case used to explain it. So let's see if we can first do that for 3 marks. In 1990, the primary sector accounted for 60.1% of the labor force, and it has dropped to 33.6% in 2012. In 1990, the secondary sector accounted for 18.5% of the labor force, and the tertiary sector accounted for 21.5%. Both sectors have grown, and the tertiary sector now accounts for 36.1%, and the secondary sector accounts for 30.3%. That's a long-winded way of addressing these 3 marks. Now we still need to get 2 marks, comment on likely changes as countries develop, and we need to give a reason why it might be typical. This is expected for emerging economies as they tend to move away from primary production and towards the provision of services and manufacturing as their economies grow. Now you could argue that this is either a 5-mark or 4-mark response, because I think that what's not absolutely clear is why it's typical, but I think it's quite clear that as countries move from move from primary sector to the tertiary sector, it indicates that they are developing economically. So yes, I think that this could be up to 5 marks. Can I say 100% confidently? No. Let's look at the next question, B. The article states that falling prices are bad for the economy. Analyze whether falling prices necessarily harm an economy. So the mark scheme is asking us to, let's expand this. The effect they want us to describe is that businesses suffer, profits fall, which reduces investment, incomes fall for consumers, not only consumers but businesses, employment is cut. In that case, consumers are disadvantaged, and then government collects revenue in tax from both businesses and individuals. But then we have to give the counter side, right? So here you can see this is one side up to 4 marks out of 5. We need to have one counter argument in there. So the article states that falling prices are bad for the economy. Analyze whether falling prices necessarily harm an economy. The keyword necessarily means, is it always going to be the case? Falling prices can be bad for an economy because lower prices reduce revenues and profits for business. This can lower the overall level of investment by firms, leading to a reduction in output. The derived demand for labor falls, resulting in increased unemployment. Higher levels of unemployment lead to reduced consumption and lower tax revenue earned by the government from both personal and corporate income tax. However, if falling prices result in lower input prices, then this could actually benefit firms as opposed to harming them. So we do have a counter argument. I think we have a very clearly explained analysis of why falling prices are bad for an economy. I would give this 5 marks. If you could improve upon it, I'd encourage you to write something in the comments section so we can take a look at it together. Now let's take a look at C. Does the article give enough evidence to lead you to conclude that the changes in the Chinese economy would be bad for countries that trade with China? Okay, again, the mark scheme is looking for us to consider how China consumes large proportions of imports of raw materials. So a fall in the price of materials and a fall in demand would support that opinion. Imports have declined. So, however, not all manufacturing has declined, and some imports of consumer durables will increase, particularly if consumption spending increases. So what we're trying to say here is that the Chinese economy is changing. It is going to be bad for some countries, but not necessarily all. And let's see if we can communicate that in this 4-mark response. The article suggests that a reduction in Chinese industrial output would reduce the demand for key raw materials such as iron ore. As Chinese firms produced less in response to falling export demand, world prices of iron ore fell. However, the article also mentions that there is a shift towards consumption and there is still a need for raw materials to produce consumer goods, such as cars, washing machines, and computers. This indicates that changes in the Chinese economy could harm some countries that trade with China, but it could also benefit them. So we have here an analysis that examines how it could harm or could be bad for countries that trade with China, but we could also see that it could benefit some. So at here, I think that it does discuss what is presented in the article. It does address that it could harm some countries, but it does look at the other side. So I would be looking at giving this kind of response a 4 marks out of 4, at worst 3 out of 4. And that leaves us with the final question. Using the article and your own knowledge, discuss what difference an investment approach to growth and a consumption approach to growth might make to an emerging economy such as China. Now, the exam board wants us to answer this question by essentially having candidates make a reasoned attempt to consider any likely changes, not necessarily from the article, so we could go from our knowledge and the syllabus, on employment, different incomes, standards of living, government tax revenue, and the rate of growth in the economy. So we're looking for up to 2 marks for each relevant suggestion. This part of the mark scheme doesn't give you much insight into what you should be writing, so hopefully after we've reviewed my answer, you're a bit clear on what needs to be done. Using the article and your own knowledge, discuss what difference an investment approach to growth and a consumption approach to growth might make to an emerging economy such as China. 6 marks. The consumption approach to economic growth is fueled by consumers purchasing more goods and services for household use. While this will certainly increase the demand for particular goods and services, consumers will drive demand and the resulting innovation from firms that seeks to meet their needs. This will increase employment in those sectors, and as the quality of goods increases, it may raise the standard of living. However, too great a focus on consumption goods may lead to a fall in the level of investment necessary to maintain the global competitiveness of domestic firms. An investment-led approach could lead to greater innovation and economic growth in the long run. This would involve greater spending by businesses and firms into capital equipment, technology, and machinery. Such investment would increase the productivity of labor and firms, allowing for a greater rate of economic growth than that fueled by consumption. So this is a 6-mark question asking us to discuss the difference. So it's become clear what the consumption approach is and what the investment approach is. We've looked at the effects on the economy, including innovation, the effects on employment, the standard of living, and long-run growth. I would say that this question has earned the full 6 marks. If you have any questions or comments about any of these answers that I've reviewed, you happen to like this format of video, leave me a comment below. This is something new that I'm trying. I hope that you guys find this stuff helpful. And if you do find it helpful, then this is something else I can continue working on for you all. So leave me feedback. Let me know how you're doing. If you have any questions, comments, again, leave those down there. And I hope that you find all of this work helpful and it helps you succeed in your classes. Again, any questions, let me know. And you can reach me at enhancedtuition@gmail.com or leave it in the comments below. That's us done, and I will see you in the next one.